The harbor at Southampton stretched gray and silent under autumn drizzle, packed with vessels that had crossed the Atlantic countless times. Row upon row of identical silhouettes filled every berth, their welded hulls streaked with rust and salt, steam winches motionless, cargo holds empty. These were Liberty ships, the ungainly workhorses that had carried the sinews of Allied victory across submarine-infested waters. Now, in October 1945, they sat idle, their purpose fulfilled, whilst harbor masters' offices wrestled with an unprecedented question. What does one do with the largest merchant fleet ever assembled when the war requiring it has ended? The scale defied easy comprehension. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards had constructed 2,710 Liberty ships, an industrial achievement without parallel in maritime history. At their peak production, the 18 shipyards involved launched 3 vessels every 2 days. These standardized cargo ships, each 441 feet long, with a deadweight tonnage of 10,500, had been designed for a single purpose: to replace merchant shipping faster than German U-boats could sink it. They succeeded spectacularly, delivering 75 million tons of cargo to Allied nations. Yet success spawned a problem of staggering proportions. By war's end, over 2,400 Liberty ships remained afloat, representing 50 million tons of shipping capacity in a world suddenly at peace. They crowded harbors across 2 hemispheres, from the Thames to Manila Bay, awaiting decisions that would determine whether they sailed on or faced the breaker's yard. 3 distinct interests competed for control of this vast fleet: the American government, which owned them through the War Shipping Administration, private shipping companies which had operated them under wartime contracts, and foreign nations desperate for merchant tonnage to rebuild their shattered economies. The decisions made in late 1945 and 1946 would reshape global maritime trade, influence the economic recovery of a dozen nations, and ultimately prove far more complex than anyone anticipated. The immediate situation facing Allied authorities in the autumn of 1945 presented both opportunity and burden. The United States Maritime Commission, which had overseen Liberty ship construction, now controlled the world's largest merchant fleet at the precise moment when peacetime commerce required far less capacity. Pre-war American merchant shipping had totaled approximately 11 million tons. The Liberty ship program alone had added 5 times that. The mathematics were inescapable. The vast majority of these vessels had no peacetime role. Yet the condition of the fleet varied enormously. Approximately 200 Liberty ships had been sunk during the war, victims of torpedoes, mines, or the occasional structural failure that plagued early examples. Another 180 had been converted to other purposes: colliers, tankers, troop ships, or the curious Z variant fitted with aircraft catapults. The remaining vessels showed every stage of wear, from ships launched in 1944 with minimal service to battered survivors of the Murmansk Run, their hulls streaked with ice damage, and their engines worn by years of hard steaming. Engineers inspecting the fleet in British and American ports during October and November 1945 classified vessels into categories: those fit for continued commercial service, those requiring major refits, and those whose condition or obsolescence made them candidates for immediate scrapping. The British government watched these proceedings with particular interest. The United Kingdom had lost 11.7 million tons of merchant shipping during the war, roughly half its pre-war total. British shipyards, focused on warship construction and now facing reconversion, could not quickly replace these losses. Britain needed ships immediately, and the idle Liberty vessels represented the fastest solution. Parallel calculations occupied officials in France, Norway, Greece, and a dozen other nations whose merchant marines had been decimated. The Liberty ships, derided during wartime as ugly ducklings with their simple lines and utilitarian construction, suddenly appeared attractive to nations lacking alternatives. Soviet authorities, having received ships under Lend-Lease during the war, now sought to retain them. The USSR had acquired approximately 200 Liberty ships through the program, vessels that had delivered supplies to Murmansk and Archangel. American diplomats anticipated difficult negotiations over their return, a prediction that proved accurate. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, vessels that had supported island-hopping campaigns sat in harbors at Guam, Okinawa, and Manila, awaiting redeployment or disposal. The War Shipping Administration faced simultaneous pressures: commercial operators demanding access to profitable routes, foreign governments requesting ship transfers, and Treasury officials insisting the fleet be liquidated to recover wartime expenditure. The American approach to disposing of its Liberty ship fleet developed through 1946 as these competing pressures crystallized into policy. The Ship Sales Act of 1946, enacted on March 8, established the framework. The Maritime Commission would sell ships to American operators at favorable terms, lease vessels to foreign governments, and scrap those deemed surplus. The legislation prioritized three objectives: supporting American commercial shipping, aiding Allied reconstruction, and avoiding the creation of a government-owned merchant marine that might distort peacetime commerce. Sales to domestic operators began immediately. American shipping companies, many of which had operated Liberty ships under wartime contracts, could now purchase them for approximately $550,000 each, roughly half their construction cost of $1.8 million. The terms attracted buyers: 10% down payment with remainder financed over 10 years at 2% interest. By December 1946, private American firms had purchased 531 Liberty ships, forming the nucleus of a dramatically expanded post-war merchant marine. Companies like States Marine Lines, Waterman Steamship Corporation, and Likes Brothers Steamship Company acquired entire fleets, repainting hulls in company colors and deploying vessels on commercial routes. Yet this program revealed immediate limitations. American operators wanted the newest, best-maintained vessels for profitable routes to Europe and South America. Older ships, those with mechanical issues, or vessels configured for bulk cargo rather than general freight, found few buyers. By mid-1947, over 800 Liberty ships remained unsold despite attractive financing. The Maritime Commission responded by reducing prices further and exploring alternative disposal methods. Some vessels were designated for the National Defense Reserve Fleet, a mothball fleet maintained for future emergencies. Others were earmarked for the remainder faced scrapping. The Reserve Fleet Program transformed scores of American harbors into ship graveyards. The James River Reserve Fleet in Virginia, established in October 1946, eventually held 835 vessels, including hundreds of Liberty ships. Similar fleets developed at Suisun Bay, California, Beaumont, Texas, Wilmington, North Carolina, Mobile, Alabama, and Olympia, Washington. By 1950, over 2,000 merchant vessels sat in these anchorages, the Liberty ships forming neat rows that stretched for miles. Preservation techniques involved draining systems, coating machinery with protective compounds, and maintaining skeleton crews to prevent deterioration. The program assumed these vessels might be reactivated for future conflicts, a prescient judgment given subsequent events. British acquisition of Liberty ships followed different mechanisms reflecting both immediate need and diplomatic complexity. Under the terms negotiated in late 1945, the United Kingdom received ships through bareboat charter, a leasing arrangement that transferred operational control whilst American ownership remained. The initial agreement, signed on January 15, 1946, covered 152 Liberty ships, with Britain paying annual charter fees of approximately $25,000 per vessel. These ships entered service rapidly, some retaining their American names, others rechristened to honor British maritime traditions. The British Ministry of War Transport distributed these vessels strategically. Many supported colonial trade routes that had languished during wartime, carrying raw materials from Africa and Asia to British ports. Others entered the North Atlantic trade, restored to the passenger cargo service that had characterized pre-war commerce. British crews adapted to the ship's quirks, The coal-fired boilers that most British vessels had abandoned decades earlier, the stark accommodation that contrasted with traditional maritime comfort, and the welded construction that occasionally produced alarming cracks in heavy seas. Despite these adjustments, the Liberty ships proved essential to British economic recovery, carrying the imports that fed the nation and the exports that earned foreign currency. British involvement extended beyond simple operation. Several Liberty ships underwent conversion in British yards, transformed into specialized vessels. Some became refrigerated ships for the meat trade from Argentina and Australia. Others received passenger accommodation, carrying immigrants to Canada and Australia in the Great Post-War Migration. The Ministry of Transport maintained these vessels until the early 1960s, when newer tonnage and improved British shipbuilding finally made them redundant. By 1963, the last British-operated Liberty ships had been returned to American control or sold for scrap. Soviet handling of Liberty ships delivered under Lend-Lease became a diplomatic irritant that persisted for decades. The USSR had received ships through various arrangements, with final tallies disputed between American and Soviet records. American sources claimed 180 Liberty ships had been transferred. Soviet documents acknowledged fewer. What remained undisputed was Soviet reluctance to return them. Under Lend-Lease terms, vessels surviving the war should revert to American ownership with provision for purchase at depreciated value. Soviet negotiators, however, argued that ships damaged during service, lost to enemy action, or heavily worn warranted different treatment. Negotiations stretched from 1945 through 1972, when a final settlement occurred. The Soviet Union agreed to pay $48 million to resolve all Lend-Lease shipping disputes, a sum covering Liberty ships and other vessels. By that date, most Soviet-held Liberty ships had been scrapped, their hulls cut up in Black Sea yards or Baltic ports. Several, however, enjoyed extended service in Soviet Arctic operations, their robust construction suited to ice-damaged waters. The diesel-powered variants proved particularly valued, operating supply runs to Siberian ports into the 1960s. Soviet modifications included strengthened bows for ice navigation and additional accommodation for Arctic conditions. The pattern established by these three major powers repeated across smaller nations. Greece received 90 DeQuate Liberty ships between 1946 and 1948, reconstituting a merchant marine devastated by war. Norwegian operators acquired 42 vessels. French companies took 43, and Italian firms purchased 54 from American stocks. The Netherlands received 31 Liberty ships to replace tonnage lost to German confiscation and Allied bombing. China acquired 33 vessels in 1946 and 1947, many of which eventually ended up in communist hands after the Civil War's conclusion in 1949. These transfers, often conducted under Marshall Plan provisions or direct foreign aid arrangements, distributed American merchant tonnage globally. Each nation adapted Liberty ships to local needs. Greek operators, facing a shipping market depressed by wartime losses and overcapacity, often purchased vessels speculatively, hoping freight rates would improve. Many Greek-owned Liberty ships traded in tramping services, carrying whatever cargoes offered profit between whatever ports required them. This unglamorous work kept the vessels employed when regular liner services proved unprofitable. Norwegian companies, with their tradition of specialized shipping, converted several Liberty ships into whale factory ships, following the Antarctic whaling fleets of the late 1940s. Italian firms used Liberty ships primarily for immigrant traffic, carrying Italians to South America and Australia in the great post-war exodus. Yet even as hundreds of Liberty ships found peacetime employment, systematic disposal eliminated the majority. The scrapping program began in earnest during 1947, driven by economic calculation. Each Liberty ship contained approximately 6,000 tons of steel, valuable material in a world rebuilding from catastrophic destruction. Scrap steel prices, inflated by post-war demand, made scrapping profitable. Breaking a Liberty ship yielded not only steel plate for remelting, but also valuable non-ferrous metals, copper wiring, bronze fittings, and brass valves. The ship's machinery could be salvaged, with engines, pumps, and generators finding second lives in industrial applications. American braking yards, located primarily in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and along the Gulf Coast, received a steady stream of condemned vessels. The process was systematic and thorough. Breakers stripped fittings and equipment first, then attacked the hull with cutting torches, reducing the vessel to manageable sections. These pieces were sorted by metal type and shipped to steel mills. A single yard might process 6 Liberty ships simultaneously, the operation employing hundreds of workers. Between 1946 and 1950, American breakers dismantled approximately 600 Liberty ships, a rate of 3 vessels per week at peak periods. British breaking yards, particularly those on the River Tees and at Inverkeithing in Scotland, received both British chartered Liberty ships returning from service and vessels purchased specifically for scrap. The Clyde and the Mersey also hosted breaking operations. British breakers paid £40,000 per Liberty ship in the late 1940s, reflecting steel's scarcity in post-war Britain. The Metal Industries Company at Faslane became particularly associated with Liberty ship breaking, dismantling dozens between 1947 and 1955. The process in Britain mirrored American practice, but operated at smaller scale, with most yards handling 2 or 3 vessels at once. The pace of disposal accelerated through the 1950s as the post-war shipping boom faded and newer, more efficient vessels entered service. Liberty ships, never intended for long service, developed structural problems. The welded construction that enabled rapid wartime production proved vulnerable to fatigue cracking. Several vessels broke apart in heavy seas, most famously the SS Schenectady, which cracked in half whilst moored in calm water in 1943, and the SS Pendleton and SS Fort Mercer, both of which broke apart during a 1952 storm off Cape Cod. These failures prompted inspections revealing widespread cracking in aging vessels. By 1960, few Liberty ships remained in commercial service outside Greek ownership, where lower operational standards and crew costs extended economic life. The environmental implications of this mass disposal remained largely unconsidered at the time. Breaking yards dumped unsuitable materials directly into harbors or onto adjacent land. Asbestos insulation, used extensively in Liberty ships, was stripped and discarded without protection. Workers contracted asbestos-related diseases decades later. The oil and fuel residues, along with paint containing lead and other toxic metals, contaminated breaking sites. Modern environmental assessments of former breaking yards reveal significant heavy metal pollution requiring remediation. These consequences, invisible in the 1940s and 1950s, represent the hidden cost of rapid disposal. Yet preservation was never entirely absent from consideration. As early as 1946, maritime historians recognized that Liberty ships represented a unique industrial achievement deserving commemoration. The problem lay in their sheer ordinariness. Unlike warships with distinguished combat records, Liberty ships were utterly utilitarian. Preserving one meant preserving a type, not a specific vessel with particular historical significance. This philosophical barrier delayed preservation efforts for decades. The first Liberty ship preserved as a museum was the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, retained on the West Coast and eventually restored as a memorial. The decision to preserve her stemmed from her participation in the Normandy invasion, providing a specific historical narrative. Restoration began in the 1970s, involving volunteers who laboriously returned systems to working condition. The O'Brien remains operational today. Berthed in San Francisco, one of only 2 surviving operational Liberty ships worldwide. She participates in occasional cruises, her triple expansion steam engine and coal-fired boilers maintained by dedicated enthusiasts. The second preserved Liberty ship, the SS John W. Brown, survives in Baltimore. Like the O'Brien, she saw service supporting the D-Day invasion, establishing her historical credentials. Preservation efforts began in 1988 when the vessel faced scrapping. The Project Liberty Ship Organization acquired her and began restoration, a process continuing today. The Brown also remains operational, offering occasional cruises that demonstrate 1940s maritime technology to modern audiences. These two vessels represent the sum total of operational Liberty ship survivors. Several other Liberty ships survive in deteriorated condition or modified beyond recognition. The SS Arthur M. Huddell serves as a fishing vessel support ship in Alaska, her hull intact but superstructure extensively modified. The Hellas Liberty in Greece, originally the SS Arthur M. Huddell, has been converted into a museum ship, though her condition has deteriorated significantly. A handful of Liberty ship hulls exist as breakwaters, their holds filled with concrete and their machinery removed, serving coastal protection in various locations. These hardly constitute preservation in any meaningful sense. The wholesale elimination of Liberty ships stands as one of history's most complete disposals of a significant technology. Of 2,710 vessels constructed, perhaps 20 hulls survive in any form, and only 2 retain their original configuration and machinery. This represents a survival rate of less than 1%, a figure that would shock preservationists if the subject were almost any other historical artifact. Yet the economics proved insurmountable. Liberty ships, designed for 5-year service lives, had fulfilled their purpose. Maintaining them required continual expenditure with no return. Scrapping them generated revenue whilst providing material for reconstruction. The calculus was brutal but logical. The influence of Liberty ships on subsequent maritime development proved subtle but significant. The standardization of design, the acceptance of welded construction, and the proof that mass production techniques could build ocean-going vessels all influenced post-war shipbuilding. The T2 tanker program, which produced standardized oil tankers, drew directly from Liberty ship experience. The C2 cargo ship, designed as a faster successor, incorporated lessons about structural strength and propulsion efficiency learned from Liberty ship operation. The concept of maintaining reserve fleets for national emergencies, tested with Liberty ships, became permanent American policy, influencing Cold War planning. The Cold War implications of the Liberty ship disposal program manifested during the Korean War. When conflict erupted in June 1950, the United States reactivated vessels from the reserve fleet, including over 500 Liberty ships. These vessels, mothballed for only 4 years, returned to service remarkably quickly, validating the preservation program. They carried supplies to Korea, proving that the emergency fleet concept worked. Similar reactivations occurred during the Vietnam War, though by then the ship's age and condition limited their utility. The last Liberty ships in American government service were retired in the late 1960s, finally ending their association with military logistics. Today, visitors to San Francisco or Baltimore can tour the surviving Liberty ships, walking decks that carried troops to Normandy and supplies to Murmansk. The experience proves revealing. The vessels feel cramped and utilitarian, their machinery primitive by modern standards, their accommodations Spartan. Yet they convey the scale of industrial achievement they represented. These two survivors, maintained by volunteers, connect modern audiences to a maritime world that vanished with shocking completeness.